that he stood about 6 feet tall, that he was scourged until his flesh was torn, that he was crucified. But what if the Passion of the Christ was never just a film? It went far beyond the limits any faith-based movie had ever dared to cross. It didn't just portray the sacrifice of Jesus, it made those involved live through it. For many, it wasn't just acting, it was a spiritual test, a life-changing experience. But what most people don't know is that behind the scenes, things were far from normal. Strange accidents, unshakable feelings of dread, unexplained events that still haunt the cast and crew to this day. Some even whispered about a presence that lingered on set. Why did Mel Gibson insist on making a film every Hollywood studio refused to touch? What drove him to cross a line no one else dared to? Keep watching, because this is the story of a man who stepped into forbidden ground and brought something back with him. Are you curious about the story behind Mel Gibson's rise to fame? If yes, leave a 1 in the comments. If not, type 0. Don't forget to like, share the video, and leave your thoughts in the comments below. Subscribe to our channel so you won't miss any of our upcoming exciting videos. Now, let's jump right into the story. Before a single frame was shot, before the blood-soaked cloak, and before the Passion of Christ became a cultural phenomenon, there was one man, Mel Gibson. Not the Mel usually described as a global superstar or an Oscar-winning director, but a man with a mission that almost no one understood and fewer still believed in. What many don't understand is that, in reality, this was not a film he had planned. It was a film he simply had to make. But even Mel could never have imagined what he was about to get himself into. He didn't know that what would happen before, during, and after this film would lead to the most transformative experiences of his life in ways he never expected. Mel's obsession with the Passion. It all began in the late 1990s, when Gibson was at a place that most Hollywood stars would call success. He was internationally famous, had box office hits, and held the rare privilege of making his own decisions in Hollywood. But behind the scenes, something very troubling had begun happening to this man. He was battling some serious demons, with addiction, depression, and an increasing sense that something was missing in his life. He was on the edge, and things were getting so bad that he began to have thoughts that were far from appropriate. But somewhere in the darkness, something strange happened. Mel suddenly reconnected with his faith. And it didn't happen in a gentle, symbolic way. It happened deeply and almost obsessively. According to Mel, in the midst of his pain, one day, he simply dropped to his knees and began begging God for help. From that moment, he started reflecting on the Gospels, especially the parts that relate to asking for God's help, parts he had read when he was much younger. And that's where the idea behind the Passion of the Christ was born. Mel once said, "I'm a bad guy, a really awful guy. My sin was the first to nail him to the cross. So I wanted to tell his story." Mel became obsessed with telling the story of Jesus Christ's final moments, not as a parable or as a Hollywood epic reworked for entertainment, but as it truly happened, with all the raw and brutal details. And so, he threw himself entirely into research. He went through the Bible, studied the Stations of the Cross, delved into historical texts, and even consulted mystical works like the Visions of Anne Catherine Emmerich. He didn't care about opinions. He wanted accuracy, realism, and authenticity. He decided that if Jesus was going to speak, he would speak in Aramaic. If the Romans were present, they would speak in Latin. There would be no English, no modernity, absolutely nothing to soften the shock of the film. And that's exactly where the problems began. Because when Mel brought the idea to several Hollywood studios, it was immediately shut down. The executives politely listened to his pitch about the brutal death of Jesus being portrayed entirely in ancient, dead languages with subtitles and with absolutely no commercial appeal. And they immediately told him that no one would watch it. They refused to fund or give a single penny. But Mel didn't give up. He realized that Hollywood wouldn't touch it unless he rewrote the script. But he also understood that if he compromised on the small details they wanted him to change, the entire essence of the film would be lost. And so, Mel Gibson did the unthinkable. Known as a talented director, actor, and producer, Mel made the courageous and risky decision to fund the entire The Passion of the Christ project himself. A huge sum of $30 million of his own money went into production, with another $15 million allocated for marketing the film. There were no outside investors, no support from major studios, and certainly no safety net to protect him in case of failure. The risks were extremely high because if this film failed, it wouldn't just be an ordinary failure. It would be a complete collapse, not only financially, but also in terms of his personal reputation. But Mel didn't care because at this point, the film was no longer just a business project. It was a calling, a mission he could not refuse. He was ready to break all the rules, to cross every boundary that others might think was impossible to cross. However, Mel's next decision raised even more eyebrows. Instead of using famous Hollywood stars, Mel decided that this film could not have distracting faces. No big names, no A-list actors who could dilute the story he wanted to tell. He believed the film needed to have an ancient, timeless, and anonymous feel, and the audience needed to see Christ, not a famous actor playing him. So, Mel sought out a fresh face, an actor who wasn't very well known, but possessed the intensity and humility necessary to portray such a challenging and demanding role. And that was Jim Caviezel. Jim was a devout Catholic actor, and at the time he was mostly known for supporting roles. However, Jim had the intensity and humility that Mel was looking for. When Mel offered him the role of Jesus, Jim didn't hesitate. He immediately accepted, ready to face whatever would come. In fact, after offering Jim the role, Mel is said to have called him back and urged him to turn it down, saying, "You'll never work in this town again." However, Jim responded with the famous words, "We all must accept our cross." And that was when Mel knew for sure that Jim was the one he had been searching for. Jesus Christ still remains a controversial figure, as he has for the past 2,000 years. His story continues to spark debates and disagreements, and while society has changed in many ways, the complexity and sacrifice of Jesus Christ remain an eternal topic. From this, the cast began to take shape, but Mel didn't stop there. He made a bold and courageous decision. He would shoot the entire film in Aramaic, Latin, and Hebrew with no modern translations on screen throughout the process. Mel's idea was to immerse the audience in the ancient atmosphere, removing any modern filters from the experience. He wanted the viewers to feel the emotion behind every line of dialogue, even if they didn't understand the meaning, so they could feel the betrayal, the suffering, and the sacrifice that Jesus endured. Whether it was the harsh sound of Aramaic, the sharpness of Latin, or the depth of Hebrew, each language had its own spiritual power, making the film not just a story, but a spiritual experience. Subtitles would be added after the film was completed, but what Mel hoped for was that even if the audience didn't understand the words, they would still be able to grasp the emotion of the story. The language became an indispensable part of the film's structure, and its sound carried even more weight than the words themselves. The harshness of Latin and the mournful rhythm of Aramaic made the world of the film feel completely detached from anything modern, yet it conveyed an intensely emotional experience. But this was not the only bold decision Mel made. Hollywood could easily have constructed a digital city of Jerusalem using green screens, but Mel said no. Instead, he wanted real terrain, rugged mountains, cracked earth, and real weather. And so, the filming took place in Matera, Italy, a historic town carved into stone. The ancient stone houses of this town provided the perfect biblical look. It was a strange, raw place, untouched by the developments of modern society. However, the conditions there were extremely harsh. The cast and crew had to endure freezing temperatures, strong winds, and unpredictable storms. But Mel didn't mind. He wanted a real, intimate, and authentic location. They built a replica of Golgotha on a hill outside the town. It was a full replica of the place where Jesus was crucified, complete with wooden crosses, dirt roads, ancient tools, and everything was real, nothing artificial or fake. As production continued, some of the crew began to feel that this film was truly different. Jim himself admitted that they all knew something strange was happening. A strong spiritual feeling permeated the set, with quiet moments of reverence, and many people were seen crying during rehearsals. Stories began to spread about an invisible spiritual power that they couldn't explain, but everyone felt it. And when the cameras finally started rolling, it was clear they were not alone on that set. Strange things began happening as soon as the cameras started rolling for The Passion of the Christ. From the very first moment, the atmosphere on set changed dramatically. This was no ordinary film set. What initially seemed like a strictly spiritual project began transforming into something else, something mysterious, a phenomenon that, to this day, many involved still can't fully explain. And it all began with a lightning strike. You see, when Jim Caviezel took on the role of Jesus, he committed himself to a physically grueling performance. This was no ordinary role. He had to endure full-body makeup, hours of hanging on the cross, being whipped, bruised, covered in dirt, and drenched in blood. But what he and the others on set didn't anticipate was that the sky would turn against him. In one scene on the hill of Golgotha, while standing on the cross, Jim was suddenly struck by lightning. The entire crew was stunned, unable to believe their eyes. The lightning strike caused him to lose his balance, and Jim was severely injured, biting his tongue and cheek. According to Jim, the lightning strike ultimately led to 2 heart surgeries, including open heart surgery and the use of a lot of medication. Fortunately, this issue was eventually resolved many years later. However, even more strangely, just minutes after Jim was struck by lightning, it struck again. This time, the lightning hit assistant director John McElhaney, who had also been struck by lightning earlier on set and was fortunate to survive. 2 lightning strikes at the same place, the same scene, at the same location. Scientists call this phenomenon extremely rare, but those on the set began to refer to it by a completely different name. Some believed it was a sign, while others thought it was a warning. But this wasn't the only strange occurrence on set. Reports indicate that members of the crew began to whisper about a strange presence on the set. Not something visible, but something they could feel, a sensation that was unexplainable. Some described feeling dizzy, nauseous, or suddenly emotional during specific moments in filming, such as during the scourging scene, the carrying of the cross, and the crucifixion of Jesus. Even Mel Gibson, who was known for his calmness and focus, was seen leaving the set during these moments. Some said he was praying, while others believed he was crying. The filming location, Matera, Italy, which wasn't known for harsh weather, began experiencing strange, unpredictable weather throughout the production. A beautiful sunny morning would turn into a dark sky by midday, only to return to a clear, windless afternoon in a matter of minutes. A scene would begin under a calm sky, and in the middle of it, strong winds would blow across the set, knocking over equipment. Sandstorms would suddenly appear out of nowhere, tearing tents from the ground. At times, everything would quickly settle back down into silence. After a while, all these strange weather changes no longer seemed like natural challenges, but rather like a warning. More and more, people began to feel that something was wrong. These phenomena didn't seem to be random, but part of a greater force influencing the film. The atmosphere on set grew more and more tense. The strange moments continued as the crew filmed the difficult scenes, where not just the physical but also the mental and emotional strength of the actors were being tested. All these mysterious events couldn't be easily explained, and everyone began to feel that this film was not just an artistic project, but a deeply spiritual event. Despite all the strange occurrences, the filming continued, and Mel Gibson, along with the cast, embarked on an unpredictable journey, not only to portray the passion of Jesus Christ, but also to confront the invisible challenges that this film brought. Challenges that couldn't be explained, but created an undeniable spiritual strength. But let's talk about Jim Caviezel, the actor who played Jesus Christ. Some say that he didn't just act as Jesus, but he actually lived through it. Did you know that in the scourging scene, the whips were carefully designed not to touch his skin? However, during one shot, the angle changed slightly, and one of the thorns pierced his back. The strike tore through his flesh, leaving a 14-inch scar. But that wasn't all. Later, while carrying the massive cross, Jim slipped and dislocated his shoulder. In fact, reports revealed that some of the screams you hear in the final cut of the film were not acting. They were real. The makeup artists later revealed that some of the bruises on his body were not makeup. They were real, and they were nearly indistinguishable. Jim also suffered from hypothermia during the crucifixion scenes, which were filmed in freezing temperatures and storms. And that's not all. He had to endure extreme physical stress and exposure throughout the filming process. His body was pushed to the brink, just like the character he was portraying. And here's the strange part. Did you realize that Jim Caviezel's initials are JC? Just like Jesus Christ. Additionally, he was 30 years old during the filming, the same age as Jesus when he was crucified. Is this just a coincidence, or is there something more to it? But Jim wasn't the only one affected on that set. Some other actors were reportedly ill during or after key scenes. There were sudden fevers, sleepless nights, and nightmares. But throughout all this, Mel Gibson never made any public statements about the supernatural events on set. However, those closest to him noticed the change. He became more withdrawn and serious. It was said that he began each day with prayer, and he was known to walk alone in the early mornings, reading the Bible under his breath. At some point, it felt as though the film had become a battleground, not between the actors and critics, but between older, more profound forces of good and evil. Mel believed that The Passion of the Christ was not just a film, it was a spiritual weapon. He believed that what was happening on that set was not just filmmaking. It was intense and inexplicable. When The Passion of the Christ finally hit theaters on February 25, 2004, it didn't just premiere as an ordinary film. It exploded like a bomb. Hollywood had turned its back on Mel. Critics had sharpened their knives before the film even premiered, and some religious leaders had prepared to either defend the film or condemn it with the harshest words imaginable. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared the world for what happened next. The ensuing controversies. The release of The Passion of the Christ wasn't the typical red carpet debut with flashing lights and celebrity interviews. There was no big press tour, no late-night talk shows, and no traditional advertising. Mel took a different approach to promoting this film, completely bypassing the traditional marketing machine. Instead, he turned to churches for help. Evangelical leaders, Catholic priests, and Christian influencers were sent early cuts of the film. Private screenings weren't held in Beverly Hills, but in church basements and conference halls across the United States. And when pastors began supporting the film from the pulpit, hyping it up and describing it as the most powerful portrayal of Jesus ever brought to the screen, something wild began to happen. The faith community rallied, taking the film to new heights. Church groups began booking entire theaters to watch the film, and some even arranged buses to transport their members. If this story surprises you, don't forget to like, share the video, and leave a comment below to let us know what you think. Make sure to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our upcoming exciting videos. Now, let's continue the story together. In fact, sermons were built around the release date. For many Christians, watching The Passion of the Christ was not just a cinematic experience, it was a spiritual event. And so, Mel Gibson's controversial project exploded into one of the largest cultural events in film history. Analysts were stunned. The film premiered on Ash Wednesday, and on its opening day alone, it grossed $23.5 million. By the end of the opening weekend, the film had earned about $83.8 million, surpassing all expectations and becoming the biggest February opening film of all time at that point. And it didn't stop there. Despite being an extremely violent religious film with subtitles, rated R, and no Hollywood stars, The Passion of the Christ still drew large audiences. By the time the film left theaters, it had grossed approximately $370 million in the U.S. alone and over $611 million worldwide, becoming the highest-grossing R-rated film in history at the time. This was not just a success, it was a phenomenon. A $30 million film independently funded by Mel Gibson had overcome all odds and challenged the rules of Hollywood, leaving the entertainment industry completely speechless. But with all the success, a wave of criticism arose. Before The Passion of the Christ was released, the film had already started causing outrage. Some Jewish organizations, including the Anti-Defamation League, accused the film of promoting anti-Semitic themes, specifically the long-held accusation that the Jews were solely responsible for the death of Jesus Christ. Abraham Foxman, the director of the Anti-Defamation League, stated directly, "Our concern is that the suffering of Christ could fuel latent anti-Semitism in those who believe that the Jews are responsible for the death of Jesus, which has always been the source of anti-Semitism in the West." However, Mel Gibson insisted that the film simply depicted the events as they occurred according to the Bible. But many scholars and activists didn't believe that. And so, heated debates broke out on talk shows, tabloid newspapers, and even within religious communities. Despite the strong criticism, people still flocked to see the film. Another major point of controversy was the film's extreme violence and brutal scenes. Critics accused Gibson of having a penchant for violence. The scourging scene alone, which lasted nearly 10 excruciating minutes, was described by some critics as excessively detailed. Audiences were reported to have fainted, vomited, or left the theater in tears. Roger Ebert, one of the few critics who tried to praise the film despite its intensity, wrote, "The film is 126 minutes long, and I guess that at least 100 minutes of it, maybe more, deal specifically and in detail with the torture and death of Jesus. This is the most violent movie I have ever seen." David Anson, another critic, wrote, "Instead of being moved by Christ's suffering or touched by his sacrifice, I felt offended by a filmmaker who intended to punish the audience for sins they know nothing about." But amidst all the flames, Mel Gibson remained silent and chose to let the film speak for itself. Internationally, The Passion of the Christ stirred just as much passion and controversy. In Mexico, the film was received with fervent devotion. In Italy and Poland, Catholic audiences packed theaters night after night. In Brazil, the film was shown in both slums and churches. But in France and Germany, where sensitivity to the history surrounding anti-Semitism is particularly strong, the film faced strong opposition, and some theaters refused to show it entirely. Within the Christian community, many praised the film as a sacred work of art. Viewers reported feeling spiritually transformed. The film highlighted not only the Passion of Christ, but also a profound spiritual journey, allowing those who watched to feel the great sacrifice and the power of faith. Despite the strong opposition from some groups, the film proved its strength in overcoming cultural and religious barriers, delivering a powerful message of love and sacrifice. And despite the heavy criticism, The Passion of the Christ became a phenomenon. A work full of controversy, yet the widespread influence it had on popular culture cannot be denied. The film was not only a financial success, but also a major religious and cultural event, affirming its importance in confronting sensitive issues of history and religion. Some even claim to have experienced physical healing or emotional breakthroughs after watching The Passion of the Christ. Churches used the film as a tool to reignite conversations about the sacrifice of Christ. Evangelists distributed recordings of the film as a tool for conversion. For many believers, this film became the most powerful evangelistic tool since the Bible itself. It was not just a movie about sacrifice. It was a religious event, reviving deep beliefs about redemption and sacrifice. But outside the church, critics, scholars, and filmmakers continued to accuse Mel Gibson of stoking religious tensions, glorifying violence, and promoting an orthodox worldview. The film, while widely embraced within the Christian community, sparked fierce reactions from opposing groups. These controversies extended beyond the realm of cinema and became a larger social issue. This backlash eventually targeted Mel Gibson's personal life. Journalists began digging into his family history, searching for stories that could escalate the debate. His father's controversial statements about the Holocaust were brought to light, and Mel's own interviews, often mysterious and defensive, only fueled the fire of the conflict. Every statement Mel made, both before and after the film's release, was scrutinized and became part of the larger debate about ethics and belief. Suddenly, The Passion of the Christ was no longer just a movie. It had become a cultural fault line, dividing public opinion and sparking deep debates about faith, history, and art. When the dust finally settled, one thing became clear. The Passion of the Christ had changed the film industry. The film proved that there was a large Christian audience that had been overlooked by Hollywood for decades. Before the film's release, few believed that religious films, especially Christian films, could attract such a large audience. After the film's massive success, studios rushed to greenlight faith-based projects. Films like God's Not Dead, Heaven is for Real, and War Room followed, with similar themes, harnessing the power of faith in modern society. However, The Passion of the Christ remains the gold standard, the one film that all the others since have tried to imitate, but none have ever been able to match. While other films have tried to replicate a similar hit, no one has been able to recreate the power and impact that The Passion of the Christ had. After the praise and criticism battled through headlines and airwaves, the spotlight eventually faded. The debates about the film no longer dominated the media, and the film entered the annals of cinema history. Though it may not have been widely recognized for its artistic merits, it certainly left an indelible mark on cultural influence. The cameras stopped rolling, and the world saw the final cut. But for those who survived and actively participated in the making of The Passion of the Christ, the story didn't end when the credits rolled. If anything, it was just the beginning. What happened to the actors, the crew, and even Mel Gibson himself in the months and years following the film's release was just as dramatic and mysterious as the film itself. Although the film brought tremendous financial success and sparked religious controversy, the consequences and events it triggered for those involved in its production continued to unfold, proving that this film was not just a cinematic work, but an event with far-reaching impact on those who participated in it. Some found God, some disappeared from the spotlight. Others seemed to carry invisible scars that they never spoke of. And a haunting pattern began to emerge, one that those closest to the project either couldn't or didn't want to discuss about life after the experience. Let's start with the lead actor of the film, Jim Caviezel. You see, before joining the film, Jim was an up-and-coming talent. He starred alongside Jennifer Lopez in Angel Eyes and received critical acclaim for The Thin Red Line. He had also appeared alongside Dennis Quaid frequently, and Hollywood saw him as a reliable leading actor, capable of making money and delivering solid performances. But then he took on the role of Jesus Christ, and his life changed forever. After the massive success of the film, you would expect Jim's phone to be ringing off the hook. But that wasn't the case. The calls didn't come in. Instead, the opposite happened. His career nearly collapsed overnight. It turned out that some people in Hollywood had labeled him as too devout, while others found him too difficult to work with. In fact, for years, industry insiders whispered that Jim may have quietly been blacklisted. Playing Jesus and publicly aligning with Mel Gibson had made him radioactive in certain circles. In an interview, Jim opened up saying, "Suddenly, I wasn't one of the top 5 actors at the studio anymore, and I hadn't done anything wrong. I just played Jesus." But here's what's important. Jim insists that he has no regrets. In fact, he admits that if he had to do it all over again, he would still take the role. Because this film was not just an acting job. It was a calling. Since then, Jim has relied heavily on his faith, taking on Christian-themed roles and speaking at religious conferences. He often becomes emotional when discussing the experience and never hesitates to describe it as a spiritual transformation. He also began speaking openly about his faith, especially after all the accusations and backlash he received following the film. In one interview, he said, "I had no choice but to defend my faith at that time. I was called anti-Semitic and everything." For Mel, the release of The Passion was supposed to be his crowning moment. He had finally proven everyone wrong. Hollywood had mocked him, and he had created a global blockbuster with an ancient language and no big stars. But while the film soared, his personal life began to spiral out of control. In the years following the film's release, Mel's public image literally collapsed. There was his 2006 arrest for driving under the influence, followed by a notorious drunken argument filled with anti-Semitic slurs. That moment destroyed his career and turned him into an outcast. But that wasn't all. Several other scandals followed. There were tabloid stories, leaked phone calls, and accusations of inappropriate behavior. Many saw it as a complete downfall, but others, particularly those who worked with him on The Passion, believe there's more to the story. They say the film changed him, that in his pursuit of telling the story of Christ's suffering, something inside him shifted. Mel himself has admitted that he was never the same after making the film. He also vaguely suggested that the backlash against him, both personally and professionally, wasn't entirely natural. He believes that it was some kind of consequence for the extraordinary and life-changing film he had created. However, despite everything, Mel remains steadfast in his belief that The Passion was a divine mission. He continues to describe it as the work of his life. In recent years, he has quietly been working on a sequel, although details remain under wraps. But what's truly strange is that, despite the film's success and attention, he rarely speaks about it anymore. Those closest to him say that certain chapters of that journey are still completely off-limits. But it wasn't just Mel and Jim who had strange experiences. Behind the scenes, something was happening with the crew. According to reports from those on set, some crew members had a change of heart, with some allegedly starting to study the Bible during breaks. Extras, technicians, crew members, and others whose names never appeared on screen quietly shared stories of dreams, visions, or unexplainable emotions throughout the production process. Perhaps one of the most profound changes occurred with Luca Lionello, a man who identified as an atheist before playing the role of Judas. After his experience on set, he suddenly decided to convert to Christianity. However, what is even more concerning is how many people involved in the making of The Passion of the Christ still refuse to speak about it, even 2 decades later. Some extras, such as Roman soldiers or townspeople, have repeatedly declined interview requests, and some crew members are said to have expressed discomfort when revisiting the experience they had. Some reports even note that journalists covering the production process encountered a strange wall of silence when trying to contact those involved. There were no scandals covered up, no crimes committed, just silence. However, a few who have spoken out often describe the filming process as spiritually intense, overwhelming, or unlike anything they had ever experienced before. For those who chose not to open up, some speculate that the emotional weight of the story and the way it was filmed created a kind of sacred space that people were hesitant to disturb. Others believe that the crew may have witnessed things that cannot be explained, and they simply didn't know how to talk about them. And then there were whispers that what happened on that set went beyond art, beyond storytelling, that it ventured into the supernatural, and everyone there knew it. The Passion of the Christ isn't just a movie. For many of those involved, it became a spiritual marker, a moment that split their lives into before and after. Jim Caviezel paid for it with his career. Mel Gibson paid for it with his reputation. Countless others walked away from the experience changed, humbled, or haunted. But none of them truly regretted it. They saw something. They felt something. And they knew that what happened behind the scenes couldn't be captured in a documentary or retold in a podcast interview. It was personal, it was sacred, and in some strange way, it's still happening. And maybe that's why the silence lingers. Because the Passion of the Christ isn't just a story about Jesus. For those who took part, they had to carry their own cross. But what do you think? Was The Passion of the Christ just a film or something more? Let us know in the comments below. If you found this story interesting and want to explore more fascinating stories like it, don't forget to like the video and share it with your friends and those around you. Leave a comment below to let us know your thoughts. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you won't miss any of our upcoming videos. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.